Today on Mayor Time, I am lucky to be with a watch media icon and our newest member of the WatchBox team, Jack Forster. For those of you who don't know, Jack started as a moderator for the watch forum Purist Pro back in the late 90s before becoming editor-in-chief for the US edition of Revolution magazine in the mid-2000s. He then became one of the early employees of Hodinkee in 2015 and worked there as editor-in-chief. As he starts his tenure with WatchBox, we're here to discuss how watch media and consumer preferences changed throughout his career in the industry and where he sees watch content moving forward. Jack, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So happy to have you here as, I guess this is your first production as part of the WatchBox team.
Yeah, I had a wonderful kind of welcome video with Tim Masso, but this is, in fact, my first, well, it's been said, it's my first official WatchBox video.
I'm honored to be here with you. So you were telling me the other day that the first press event you went to as part of the industry was for the Ulysse Nardin Freak, which, dare I say, is one of the most innovative watches of all time. Talk about that event, you know, the launch of that watch and where the industry was in that particular moment.
Sure. I mean, it was, well, the Freak launched in 2001, and Rolf Schneider, who had kind of brought Ulysse Nardin back from the dead in the 1990s, had brought the watch to New York, and it was the first opportunity that any of us had had a chance to see it. And I should preface this by saying that when I first got interested in watches really seriously, in the early mid-1990s, there really wasn't any watch internet. I mean, there were electronic bulletin board services. You could talk about watches on those, on Usenet news groups. But it was still, most of the action was in print. And the watch magazines were not terribly widely read. I mean, if you went into a magazine shop and you wanted to buy a watch magazine, you would find them on the bottom back rack next to the doll collecting and model railroading magazines. And it's just like, it's amazing to see how much things have changed over the last 25 years. And even leading up to the Freak, you know, Purists Pro, which back then was the Purists.com, and Timezone.com, were the first real sort of online watch communities. You know, they were the prototypes for the kinds of interactions that we now take for granted on, you know, across social media. And Purists Pro had a really interesting orientation. It was very much sort of a meritocracy of knowledge. It was explicitly forbidden to talk about price, which is, you know, kind of an amazing thing to think about nowadays when it seems like it's all we talk about. Mm-hmm. And going to my first watch event and actually being able to see the Freak was, it was mind-blowing. I mean, I had never seen that many beautiful watches together in one room before. So Rolf Schneider brought over the Freak. He also brought over a number of other Ulysse Nardin watches, including minute repeaters and hour strikers. And, you know, I mean, I'd never held a minute repeater in my hands before. I'd never heard one strike in person before. But the star of the show is the Freak. And
we have a very special version with us here today.
Yep. The one that we have here today is from 2000, I think it's from 2010, and is a prototype of the Freak Diavolo. And this is an interesting evolution of the Freak because it's actually a tourbillon within a tourbillon. Now, the original Freak was, in a sense, a tourbillon watch. Sometimes, you know, it's sometimes called a carousel tourbillon watch, and nobody had ever seen anything like it. 8-day movement. The entire movement rotated under the dial once per hour, so the movement basically was the minute hand. Mm-hmm. Right. And it was extraordinary from a design standpoint. I mean, it kind of single-handedly started off or jump-started the era of the hyperwatch, not the hype watch, the hyperwatch.
Right.
Which is, you know, kind of a term I like for the usually large, often extremely complicated timepieces that a lot of brands were competing to produce right around the beginning of the millennium, really right up to the financial crisis and even, you know, a little bit afterwards. But one of the most interesting things about it, and this, we were talking about this earlier, is that it was the first watch to actually have silicon components in it. Right. And silicon has become kind of ubiquitous for technical reasons in watchmaking, but you know, back then it had never been used in a watch before. And the beginning of the use of silicon in the watch industry happened because of this it was a very strange consortium of 3 brands, Ulysse Nardin, Patek Philippe, and Rolex. For some reason, the 3 of them got together and partnered with a technical institute in Switzerland called CSEM. But basically, it was a center that specialized in research into micromechanics. And silicon was an interesting material for brands to start working with from a technical standpoint because it was non-magnetic and it could be fabricated using the same technology that you use for making microprocessors. It could be fabricated to micron tolerances repeatedly over and over and over again. So instead of making a balance spring by drawing out wire and then putting it through a roller and then bending it and then heat treating it, tempering it, you could just take a silicon wafer, it looks like a flat black dinner plate, and you stick it in a etching machine and out come balance springs that will work. Every single one is exactly alike and every single one will work to the exact same spec in exactly the same way. And they've become, because of their reproducibility and reliability, they've become kind of the mainstay of a lot of modern technical watchmaking. But back then it was like, holy smokes, silicon in a watch.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it was way ahead of its time, different than anything anybody had done before. There was no crown on the watch. You wound it, on the back of the watch. Yeah. You set the time by pulling up this little lever here, and then it allowed you to rotate the bezel, which would rotate the movement, which is the minute hand, and then the main plate is the hour hand. Right. So a different way of showing the time, and then I think all the brands started competing with one another then on how to show the time in the most complicated manner, right? Right. That was then the competition, and you started to see watches like from MB&F. We have a cool one here, the HM3, and I know that you covered MB&F watches and the rise of Max's brand. Talk about those and what else started emerging as a result of that time.
I met Max for lunch in the Museum of Modern Art restaurant when he brought HM2 to New York for the first time. And, I'd never seen anything like it. And he was the absolute antithesis of what you would expect from a Swiss watch executive. And he'd been at Harry Winston, and he had launched another series earlier, which we should talk about as well, the Opus series. But here was this guy, wearing very, very casually dressed, wearing Converse sneakers, carrying around this really very strange-looking watch that didn't look like anything anybody had ever made before. And we had a wonderful conversation about it, and a wonderful conversation about what had kind of driven him to start MB&F. And he said, on many occasions since, he could have spent the rest of his life in the Swiss watch industry as a Swiss watch industrial executive. And he said to me, I had a closet full of nice suits and I had a nice apartment in Geneva, and I could have just kept collecting a paycheck, but I was so bored. And worse than bored, I think spiritually unfulfilled, as well. I mean, he really wanted to be 100% emotionally committed to what he was making. So he was definitely part of the rise of the hyperwatch. But to me, Max has always been somebody who's really very, very unique. I mean, his doing all of these different horological machines over the years required him to be ceaselessly and inexhaustibly inventive. And oftentimes, against really, really serious challenges. I mean, one of the many interesting things about MB&F and the horological machines is that, they don't make very many of them. So if you're only ordering, I don't know, let's say 100 crystals a year, and there are these really, really complicated, crystal shapes that take forever to cut, you're not first on your supplier's list of, who's ordering thousands, right? Yeah, and if they're 6 months late delivering, then Max is 6 months late delivering to his clients, and he just kind of kept going and going and going, and even before he started MB&F, when he was at Harry Winston, he started something called the Opus series, which I think a lot of people have forgotten, but for many years, the most exciting part of going to Basel World was actually seeing the newest Harry Winston Opus watch.
I remember that period, yep.
And
we have a cool one here with us today. A more traditional classic look. I mean, basically the story behind the Opus line was, let's use the Harry Winston name, take a watchmaker who's less known, and they'll produce a watch. And F.P. Journe at that time wasn't well known. Now he's, the face of independent brands, or one of the most successful independent brands. But at that time, no one knew him. And so he made a watch, under the Harry Winston name. Here we have it today, the Opus 1 Reserve de Marche, which has the same look that the Reserve de Marche has today for the line.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting. This is, I mean, you remember because you've been around long enough to have actually seen some of the Opus watches at Baselworld, but like this is actually relatively restrained,
big time
for an Opus series watch. I mean, do you remember the first one that you saw?
I don't. I remember.
Anything particularly stick in your mind?
I don't. None of them stand out. I mean, you showed me the one the other day, which had the two.
Yeah, but that was Opus 11. Which had a mechanism under the dial in which there was something like 64 different precisely shaped geometric tiles. And in the center of the dial was a number that represented the hour. And every time you hit a new hour, the entire thing would rotate and all of these tiles would kind of flip around each other. They looked like a flock of mechanical birds. And the new hour would be displayed. So that one was bananas.
Right. It was borderline unwearable. I mean, that was at the point, it was all about high complications, mechanical innovation, not really wearability or seeing the time. Again, showing it in the most complicated way. Later in the decade, there was this return to classicism, more traditional watches, and there was a rise of interest in vintage pieces. So, we have a couple pieces here today. Like a 2537 Patek that one thing I really love about Patek Philippe is that they look back at their historical records, watches they've made in the past, and this watch right here looks somewhat like a 5196 or a 6119 that's still made today, with the second subdial down at 6 o'clock, very simple. And here we have a 5212, one even right behind us. And the case was inspired by a watch that they made back in 1955, the 2512. It has the same stepped lugs here, and we also have this 6265 Rolex Daytona. Vintage Daytona certainly went nuts, during that era. Talk about that time and why we went from these crazy contraptions to the more classic, simple watches that were made previously, before those.
I think a bunch of things happened. I mean, first of all, the financial crisis happened.
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
And all of a sudden we were seeing watches that cost tens of thousands of dollars, literally trading for pennies on the dollars from gray market retailers. I mean, just the bottom fell out of the economy, the bottom fell out of the watch market. And the watch brands were kind of, if you had overinvested, well, it didn't look like overinvesting at the time, but if you had invested heavily in a 5-year plan that involved making $250,000 and up ultra complicated watches, you were kind of in serious trouble, because it's just not a business anymore. So that's one thing that happened. Another thing that happened is I think tastes kind of swing in cycles. You go back and look at the history of watchmaking in the 1700s, for instance. This is really before there was such a thing as precision watchmaking. As seconds per day accuracy didn't exist. Right. So what were watches? They were mechanical toys for extremely rich individuals, merchant princes or actual princes. And they would have things like mannequins under the dial that, appeared to be striking a bell whenever the gong struck. Then you get into the 1800s, and all of a sudden you have watches that are capable, portable timepieces, capable of keeping time to within seconds per day. And watchmaking got very serious. It got very sober. The fanciful stuff was still being done, but it was definitely not where the center of gravity was. So like fast forward, very sharply to 2009, there's only so much wedding cake you can eat every day. After a while, I think people just got satiated with kind of crazy, over-the-top design. And, the companies like MB&F, which started in the pre-crisis era and which rode the first wave of interest not only in independent watchmaking, but in really innovative watch design, the ones that stuck around were the ones that really had something deeper going on in terms of design or in terms of watchmaking competency or both. So post-financial crisis, 2015 comes along. Hodinkee had been founded in 2008, which was an interesting time. It was actually founded during the financial crisis because Ben Clymer was working as a project manager at a bank and had nothing to do, so he thought to himself, all right, what I want doesn't exist in watch media, I'm going to start something.
Right, and at that time, it was when you would go to Baselworld and they had the magazine booth.
Yes.
And so I remember, Danny, before we went home every year, would go and grab 40 magazines and ship them all back in a suitcase.
Yeah, the magazines were king.
Right.
They were king.
And that's where you learned. That's where you saw all the content and all the brands were advertising there. And it's such it wasn't that long ago, right? It's such an antiquated
no, it's not actually that long
idea
ago.
now, you know, of going and buying all these magazines, but that's how you got the info, the intel, the novelties. And then Hodinkee came along, you know, at that time.
And, you know, I mean, as press, you would go there and you couldn't bring back all of the press releases. You would have these beautifully produced press releases. They were like little miniature, you know, works of art on paper, some of them. They were so nicely done. And you would put them in a giant box and you would have them shipped back to the home office. And, you know, and I was working out of my apartment, was when I was with Revolution Magazine, working remotely. And, you know, my apartment was full every spring of like stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of really, really beautiful watch catalogs, but there was just no place to put them. And it was a very inefficient, in retrospect, a very inefficient way of communicating. Right. So 2008, Ben Clymer founds Hodinkee. 2015, I left Revolution and joined Hodinkee. And I was, I think, employee number 6.
Okay.
And this was really, it was definitely not when the watch community at large started getting interested in watches, in vintage watches specifically. But I think it was definitely when I started to notice how interested people were in vintage watches. And during the time that I was there, I mean, a lot of different things happened. And that particular site became a huge, huge source of information on vintage watches, vintage watchmaking, vintage watch collecting. And I think that interest in vintage was partly driven by new ways of communicating. But it was also driven by a desire for something that represented a little bit more permanence in terms of value than some of the stuff that was going on in the period, say, you know, 2004 up to the financial crisis and a little bit beyond. Mm-hmm. You know, 2008, 2009 was the financial crisis. Opus 11 was a crazy watch, but that actually launched in 2011, which was not the time to launch a watch like that.
Right.
And, you know, that's because the product development cycle for watches is really long. So we didn't really see things start to trail off and evolve into a more classical perspective from modern brands until several years after the financial crisis. All of the crazy stuff and some of the crazy brands, you know, got kind of cleared out. But then it became clear that people really wanted, and it wasn't an age-related thing either. I mean, both older and younger collectors were looking backwards for real enduring value and real enduring classical design, rather than looking forwards and expecting, you know, people didn't really want wacky innovation necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like you asked me, what was your favorite Opus, and I'm like struggling to even remember all of them, right? Yeah. It's like they didn't last, they didn't stand the test of time like these, you know, vintage pieces, which, you know, now the premier brands are still looking back into their archives and making, you know, re-editions, you know, such as this 5212. But one thing I think that you did when you went to Hodinkee is you brought light to these brands that were lesser known at the time, such as Grand Seiko. I think that was the brand that you did it the most for.
Yeah, and Grand Seiko is a really interesting example because they actually had exactly what people wanted at the time. They just the people who wanted what Grand Seiko had to offer just didn't know that they could get it from Grand Seiko. So, you know, I saw my first Grand Seiko in the early 2000s when you still could not get them anywhere except Japan. I think there was one Seiko boutique in Paris, oddly enough, where you could get Grand Seiko, and that was kind of it. And then the brand started, and you know, it was a watch that was given to a moderator on thepurist.com when he graduated from watchmaking school, and he was absolutely over the moon, much happier than if we'd just given him a Rolex. And, you know, I mean, nothing against Rolex, but, you know, Grand Seiko was a real, like, you had to be a real insider. It was a real inside baseball move to wear a Grand Seiko in like the mid-2000s.
Right.
And then the brand started to become available internationally again, and communicating about them was a really interesting and very enjoyable thing to do because the quality was so high relative to the price.
Right.
You know, I mean, you would look at these amazing dials. The dial furniture is gorgeous.
We have a great one here today with the SBGA 413, the spring dial. You know, there's the Four Seasons, but yeah, I mean, this watch is, the case is outstanding, the dial is outstanding, the movement, you know, the spring drive, which I know you wanted to touch on. We have two special spring drive movement pieces here. We have, you know, the SBGA 413, but then we also have the SBGD001, big chunk of platinum 8-day power reserve.
Yeah, I think
piece.
this is a super entertaining watch to me. I mean, it's a giant platinum watch, but it's also like, I mean, everything's in proportion. I mean, there's no clutter. Everything's very simple. I mean, it reminds me a lot of the Crador watches, and I think that it was certainly partly inspired by the Eiichi 1 and Eiichi 2. And you turn over the watch and you look at the movement, and at first you don't kind of get what's going on because it's really very simple in a lot of respects. There's not a whole lot, you don't have a ton of different bridges with a ton of different finishing techniques, but there's a harmony to the distribution of the components that you really do start to notice after a while. And I mean, leaving aside the fact that this is, as we said, a giant platinum watch, and I mean, doesn't everybody out there needs a giant platinum watch, right? Aside from the fact that it's a giant platinum watch and a very luxurious watch, it's also just really, really beautifully made. The proportions are absolutely fantastic, and it has that property that you want a watch to have if you're going to spend a ton of money on a watch. The longer you have it, the happier you are that you got it. It doesn't become a source of disappointment.
Right.
And it's very easy, well, not very easy, but it does happen in some cases that you buy a watch and the longer you own it, the less you enjoy it. The more of a source of disappointment it becomes, the more a source of frustration it becomes.
Once the honeymoon phase is over, you're no longer... Yeah, that's when you know you really love a watch, is when you like it more a year down the road than you did the first day that you owned it.
Sure.
I have a piece in my collection that it was interesting. I have a parking meter resonance, as they call it. And when I first saw it, I was literally my least favorite watch in the entire lineup. I was like, it's borderline ugly. It's not symmetrical. And it's hard to read the one side. And now I own it. Now it's the watch, and I love it. But it's like an acquired taste, and those are the ones that you want to go. It's like when you take your time with a watch purchase, you want to make sure that you're going to like it. Years down the road, not just for a week, for a month.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to predict. What you're going to end up warming up to over the long term. I mean, that particular watch, if you had known it only from brief exposure. Or from pictures, on the internet or in a magazine. Well, we're definitely in the post-magazine era. But you might never have given yourself the chance to experience it for the length of time necessary to appreciate it for what it is. And we miss so much of that. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because now we're talking about sort of the evolution of the watch internet 2.0 and the influence of social media and social media influencers. But there's so much desire to consume rapidly and to churn out content rapidly and to kind of be on trend, on top of the next trend, on top of the next hype. Like we miss something if we don't give ourselves time to think about these things. And you talk about something like any Journe resonance watch. You're talking about an idea that's been around for over 200 years. Mm-hmm. It's extremely difficult to do. I mean, I don't know if people necessarily appreciate how hard it is to make a resonance watch, but it requires Breguet was making resonance pocket watches. They were big, and they challenged him to the limits of his skill. F.P. Journe is taking the same idea and putting it into a wristwatch, and they have to be very, very, not only do they have to be very precisely made, they have to be very finely adjusted as well. Well,
you have George Daniels, one of the greatest watchmakers of all time, saying what an amazing feat that is. I mean, if you have somebody of his caliber saying, like, what you've done is amazing, you've done something special.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So you started talking about how, social media, Instagram, and I think, the rise of I think Instagram really helped the watch industry. People could see watches that they weren't exposed to otherwise, but it created this tendency for people to buy watches based off of what they do socially as opposed to what they do mechanically.
Right.
And it developed this hype watch, not hyper watch.
Right.
We had the hyper watch. We had then this renaissance to traditional watches. Yeah. We had these underground watches, which
we fled desperately and fearfully into conservatism.
Right. And then we brought out a couple here today. We have the 5711, the Jumbo from AP, mm-hmm. and the steel ceramic bezel Daytona, which I think are three great representations of hype watches. And it was like nothing I've ever seen before. I mean, you tell me, people, I mean, the values of them
I think,
were going up.
honestly, I think you're better equipped to speak about that aspect of it than I am.
It was insane. I mean, literally for the course of maybe 6 months, the watches were going up in value weekly. I mean, it was insane. You know, you had a 15202, which, look, I mean, it has historical significance. The Royal Oak is one of the greatest icons in the watch industry of all time, okay? Yeah. Made back in 1972. But you have, like, you know, a time date watch that doesn't even have a quick set date going for 6 figures. I mean, it was like, you know, think about what else you could have bought with that amount of money. And it was just basically everyone wanted those watches and were ignoring, you know, everything else that was out there. I mean, there's so many amazing options out there, and even within just their own lines. Let's say, you know, Patek Philippe. I mean, look, it caused Thierry Stern to discontinue the 5711. It's like, whoa, like we make you know, the Calatrava line, Complications, the Gondolo, the Ellipse, even, which, you know, people don't even talk about. You know, so it overshadowed everything else that was out there. It was bizarre, and it's since, you know, cooled off, but it was an unprecedented period.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one point worth making and making pretty strongly is that, like, just because something is a hype watch doesn't mean it's a bad watch.
Definitely,
right?
Definitely, without a doubt.
These are, you know, 3 great examples of hype watch and what hype can do to the, you know, kind of exposure a watch gets, the desirability of the watch, how badly people want to get it, and, you know, how willing they are to kind of, you know, stab their own mothers in the back in order to get one. But at the same time, like, they didn't become hype watches for no reason. You know, these are 3 absolute classics of modern watchmaking. You know, the 15202 is, I mean, who doesn't love a jumbo? You know, I mean, it has one of the most beautiful movements of all time, thinnest full rotor automatic winding movement from 1967 right on up until the present day. Its record for thinness has never been beaten in a full rotor automatic, which is kind of amazing considering how many records for ultra thin watchmaking have fallen. I mean, it's a fantastic watch. This Daytona is a fantastic watch. Different value proposition, but it's still a fantastic watch. The Patek is a fantastic watch. I mean, the fact that for a lot of its history it was not really considered the most interesting watch that you could get for the money from Patek Philippe is not, it's not due to any fault in the design, it's not due to any fault in the execution, it's just people's tastes changed.
Right, yeah, I mean, it was fascinating how these were watches that were discounted, you know, 10 years ago. And then they went to watches that were going for, you know, 5x premiums. I mean, it was just insane. I mean, it was amazing, but it shows again how times change, tastes change, and we evolve, right?
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
And then I think, like, simultaneously, while you know, hype watches were becoming part of the industry, you had this rise of independence, right? And look, COVID happened just as, like, the financial crisis affected the watch industry. COVID greatly affected the watch industry. People were home; they were bored. You couldn't spend money, you know, traveling to the south of France or going on a fancy trip with your family and spending money on experiences, going to concerts, whatever it may be.
Exactly.
So you had you know, your discretionary income. You were able to read about watches, learn about them, and so, you know, I think the audience for watches grew by a significant multiple.
Huge.
And so that, I think, perpetuated the hype watch craze, right? Because more people wanted them, and those were like the staples. They are amazing, so it got a little carried away there. And then it also caused people to look at the other alternatives that were out there, some of the lesser known names. And you had certain brands, you know, like Debatoon and Grubel Forsey. You know, both those brands are doing extremely well now. Those were brands that, you know, struggled to even sell out. And now you have waiting lists for the watches, which is crazy. I mean, even 5 years ago, if I had told you, you know, you're going to struggle to get a Grubel Forsey Balenciaga or a Debatoon Stradivarius, it would have said, what are you talking about? These are watches retailers can't give away.
Yep. Yep. I mean, it's a funny thing, you know, independent watchmaking really started to become a phenomenon on watch forums in the early 2000s. There was always a small, serious, dedicated group of collectors who really wanted the next interesting thing, the next creative thing. But it's very hard to build a business on that, you know. And I think that we're at an interesting point now where brands that they're fantastic brands, but they've spent a significant chunk of their existence kind of on life support. Now all of a sudden people are hungry for what they offer. And I think, again, as with all of the trends we've discussed, there are a number of different reasons why this happens. When you first start buying luxury, watches, the logical thing happens, which is that you become aware of the high visibility stuff first. So you become aware of Rolex Daytonas, you become aware of GMT Masters, you become aware of AP Royal Oaks and Patek Nautiluses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Nowadays, you're definitely going to run into a Grand Seiko even, much sooner than you would have 10 years ago, much more easily. But after you kind of go through that first round of experiencing and collecting and owning, you start. There's only so many. Well, this is not a very good joke to make right now, but there's only so many Rolex you can buy. But the sentiment really speaks to the fact that it's very easy. It happens eventually that tastes change. It happens eventually that your tastes become saturated, and people start to look for something that represents a feeling of connection, not just to a brand, but to a person. And like a big part of the reason that people love to collect independents, a big part of the attraction, has always been that you have a relationship with a person. I mean, people buy MB&F watches. I mean, Max is very, very good about making sure that everybody who's involved with the project, the friends are in the foreground. But at the same time, you want to feel like you have a relationship with somebody who is emotionally and creatively invested in what they're doing.
That's why I think Moser's doing so well
right
now. The Melon brothers are so passionate about the brand, and people feel that.
Yeah.
And they feel like they're part of this vision, this journey that they're on, and it's amazing watching the brand, how successful they've been of late. But it's understandable. People feel that emotional attachment to it.
Yeah, and I mean, you buy a De Bethune watch, and you're carrying around a record of Denis Flageolet's creative life on your wrist. Sir David Solomon said, when you carry a Breguet pocket watch, you feel like you have the brains of a genius in your pocket, which sounds kind of like messy. But it's the same thing happens when you put on a watch from MB&F or from De Bethune or from a Grubel Forsey. You feel like you're getting something that somebody really, and it's true, they worked against the odds to make it happen. Right. Because they're highly idiosyncratic, highly personal, creative visions. And I mean, let's face it, you look at the level of finishing, the level of care and work. I mean, the design is a little bit polarizing. It's definitely not for everybody. Mm-hmm. I mean, if this is the way that your tastes tend, this might not be the watch for you. But there's absolutely no denying the value that it represents and the persistence and determination that it represents.
Right.
And that is a fantastic, fantastic thing.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. It's interesting. You were saying how a lot of new blood came into the industry recently, and I think that's what contributed more to the hype watch, because these are the most visible pieces, like you said. Right. And I've seen so many collectors, myself included, you go full circle. So basically, like, you learn about Rolex first, and then you learn about JLC, let's say, okay, and you all of a sudden you're like, oh, I just got a Memovox, like an alarm watch, and you're like, oh, I'm more sophisticated than Rolex, like I bought in-house movement, whatever it may be, sure, and you go experiment with some other brands, and then you come full circle and you realize that Rolex is perfect for what it is. I mean, like, a utility watch, like they're tanks, they're versatile, they're amazing. So it's interesting watching the evolution of a collector. But I've seen that where basically, and then you realize where you should fall, right? Once you get you have you're fortunate enough to be exposed to different watches from different brands, but they all represent something different. It's why watches are just so amazing. You could have a watch made from start to finish by one watchmaker, and you love that, or you could have a Grubel Forsey that they make a couple hundred watches a year now max, and they have 100 employees all working towards making I mean, basically every employee makes one watch, more or less. I mean, the amount of employees they have to their annual production. So yeah, I mean, it's so where do you think we go from here, Jack? I mean, now here you are at WatchBox. You've been here, only a couple weeks, but why are you excited to be here, and where do you think watch content, watch media goes moving forward?
Well, people like you are a big part of the reason that I'm excited to be here. There's a level of knowledge of both watches, the watch industry, and how collector and client tastes evolve, which here that level of knowledge is very, very, very high. Another reason that I'm really excited to be here is this. I mean, you know, to actually be able to, for a watch writer, to actually be able to see this incredible variety of watches, everything from the most classical to the most hyped to the some of the most technically innovative watches in the world, watches from independent watchmakers from arguably the greatest maker of mass-produced watches on the planet. I mean, this is amazing. And over the pandemic, I spent 2.5 years trying to write about watches, often without ever actually being able to see them. There were no trade shows. It was very, there were no collector events, or it was very, very hard to get to them on the rare occasions that they did happen. And if what you write about are cars, you need to drive a damn car every once in a while. I mean, it's very hard to write about wine if you don't drink wine occasionally.
Right.
And it's very hard to write about watches if you don't get a chance to actually hold them, look at them, feel them, put them on your wrist, and only then are you equipped to sort of understand what they really represent. And I mean, it's a tough thing to say in an era of so much, remote communication over social media. But there's really no substitute for direct personal experience. When you come right down to it, it's very, very hard to kind of get a watch unless you spend a little time with it in person. Now, where's watch media going? I mean, I think that, I was around for the very beginning of the watch internet, electronic bulletin board services, Usenet news groups. I mean, seems incredibly primitive. Well, it seems incredibly primitive because it was incredibly primitive. And then there was the first generation of forums. Gradually, the magazines began to become more specialized. The magazines reacted by becoming more beautifully produced, more lavishly produced, especially Revolution was a pioneer in that respect. Then the second generation of online watch resources like Hodinkee came along, and I think Hodinkee really defined that era.
Big time.
But now I think what we're going to see is multi-channel communication where you choose whichever channel is most appropriate to the subject matter, to the content. And so the death of watch magazines has been predicted over and over again, but the ones that are good are still good. They provide exactly what seems to be the most successful formula for publishing magazines nowadays. You need to have a focus, you need to have something specific, and you need to serve a specific audience. Social media is not going anywhere.
No.
And the presentation of long-form written content is not going anywhere because that's just the best place to present certain kinds of content, especially reference content for collectors and reference technical content. And I mean, WatchBox has really forged very far ahead in terms of video production. It's a primary venue of communication for WatchBox. And the only video is so many things that we want communication to be. It's immediate. You feel a sense of direct connection to the people who are having the conversations and the products. The only disadvantage that it has, and this is a publisher's problem, is that it's more expensive. But I think I don't think it's the wave of the future. I think it's here, and I think it's here to stay.
Well, thank you for the kind words. We couldn't be more excited to have you on the team, and yeah, we're going to have a lot of fun. When we were just talking about your time in the industry, and you told me about the Freak, I was like, we have a cool one of those that you won't see anywhere else, that belonged to Patrick Hoffman. And then we talked about the rise of MB&F. We have some of those, and it'll be a lot of fun, getting around these watches together, getting our customers, in front of you, and you're one of the more knowledgeable guys that there is, and I just love speaking to people who like you who have this wealth of knowledge, and I feed off of it, right? Because so much of it's about the people, right? You have access to the watches, and then you have this emotion that watches bring together people from all different backgrounds, from all different locales, and you could, a stranger that you would never talk to otherwise, you put several different watches on a table, you become like best friends.
Yeah.
And that's just one of the coolest parts about it. It's why I feel so fortunate to do what I do. And just thanks for coming on with me, and we'll look forward to many more combos and events together.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, holy smokes, this is a hell of a start.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.